Welcome to the Fellows Cafe. Well, this is my fourth video on the subject of James Joyce's monumental, and as I've said before, monumentally misunderstood classic Ulysses. What I've tried to do in the previous videos is to hint at a radically different reading of Joyce and his work, one that is plain and simply less academic than poetic. Now, I've tended to summarize that distinction between an intellectual academic reading of Ulysses and a poetic one with the phrase, Bloomsday is for the masses, Dedalusday for the few. Bloomsday and Dedalusday referring also, of course, to the day in which the events of the book Ulysses take place, June 6, 1904. What I mean to say with that little phrase is something so exceedingly simple and yet so overlooked today that great works of art such as Ulysses are buried beneath mountains of learning and analysis, and as a result their magic and relevance to our lives is virtually lost. Peter Eckermann in his Conversations with Goethe put it this way: I am therefore always surprised at the learned who seem to suppose that poetizing proceeds not from life to the poem, but from the book to the poem. That is, the learned and scholarly always make the mistake of believing the context of a work of art, that which underlies and inspires it, other books or ideas rather than life itself. So with that in mind, I thought I'd give you a plain and simple synopsis of what's really going on in each of the episodes of the book, a sort of overview, if you will, to each chapter, what's actually taking place beneath the stylistic surface. As I've said before, for me, Ulysses, more than any book I know, is a vast meditation upon all life, and like life, it lies right out there before us for us to experience and plumb, if we have the time and the courage, that is. To put it another way, it only seems like I'm talking about the book Ulysses, but what I'm actually talking about is us, you, me, and the world we inhabit. Anyway, let's get on with things. However, before we get to episode 1, let me just say a few quick words on the book as a whole. As I've been trying to say, rather than a modern-day retelling of Homer's Odyssey, pretty much what everyone would have us believe, which, by the way, I've never quite seen the point or relevance to ourselves of, it's actually something far more revolutionary and relevant to who we are today, and possibly where we're going into the future. Now, I say that knowing full well most people are probably not ready for that aspect of the book, or for that matter, what is really going on here at the Fellows Cafe. No offense intended, but most people are still stuck in old ways of thinking, old habits of mind and educational curriculums, and old systems of belief. And you know what? I'm all right with that. The door is open for anyone to wander in or leave at any time. As I've said, if it ain't for you, don't waste your precious time. I'm not trying to teach or impose anything on anyone, because lasting change is never imposed from without. It grows organically from within, as Joyce the artist fully understood. After all, he did name one of his 3 principal characters Bloom, didn't he? And as a matter of fact, that truth about lasting change growing organically from within is actually at the heart of episode 2 of Ulysses, as we'll soon see. Anyway, if not a modern-day retelling of the Odyssey, what then is Ulysses? Well, simply put, it is the story of James Joyce's own awakening to the wonder and mystery that is all life around him and around us today, in this world and this universe we, you, me, and Joyce inhabit, or inhabit it in his case. And that's it. Alright, hopefully keeping that in mind, let's look at what is really taking place in each of the episodes of Ulysses in plain-spoken, straightforward language. Oh, just one last thing before we get going. Much has been made of Joyce's use of interior monologue and stream of consciousness techniques. That's because characters in Ulysses, much as we do today, live a great deal in their heads. Now, action in Dublin at the time, as much as today, or perhaps even more, was limited or restricted in scope, and when action for Joyce's characters, as for us, is restricted, thought multiplies. So, whereas action does occur in Ulysses, we are largely, though not always, going to experience that action through the eyes and in the thoughts of 3 principal characters. Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Marion Molly Bloom. And as we'll soon learn, each of these principal characters are deeply isolated from society in their own way, which of course further drives the whole interior monologue thing. And finally, what's more, again as overview to the main action of the book, events of the day, June 6, 1904, will precipitate a sort of isolation transcendence in each of the three principal characters. Wow, isolation transcendence. Now where did that come from? Anyway, let's get on with chapter 1. So here we go. Chapter 1 from the viewpoint of Stephen Dedalus introduces us to three young men on the threshold of adulthood. I say on the threshold because when you think about it, they have yet to assume their roles or stations in the adult world. In their early 20s, they're sharing accommodations in the Martello Tower on the outskirts of Dublin, just as a great many poor student-type young people around the world do today. There's Buck Mulligan, stately and plump, a medical student, clever, mocking, extremely witty and outgoing, the young man of science. Then there's Haynes, an English Oxford student of literature visiting Ireland to do research on Irish national literature and folklore, the young man of letters. And finally there's Stephen Dedalus, neither a student of science nor a student of literature, who perhaps some of us have already met if we happen to have read Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Dedalus is plain and simply undefinable. He is the young man of art, the shaman, and Buddha to be, as I put it in the last video. Now, think about this simple situation for a moment. Mulligan and Haynes will graduate university and have solid, respected careers waiting for them, one as a doctor and one as professor of English. They'll undoubtedly mature into upstanding pillars of their respective communities and, what's more, upholders of the status quo. However, Stephen is another matter altogether. He is the young Joyce at the tender age of 22 or 3, alone, without friends or prospects, and he is unlike anyone you've encountered in literature or life. Many writers have written about themselves. I wonder if any of them have been as candid as I have. Those are the words of James Joyce, referring to Stephen Dedalus. So why, I can't help asking, does virtually everyone dismiss Stephen as marginal or irrelevant to the main events of Ulysses? Now let me try and give you an idea of where the young Stephen/Joyce is at the book's opening around 8 o'clock in the morning, June 6, 1904. Years ago I posted a piece on my blog at omphalloscafe.com I titled The Last School, where I tried to capture the essence of the genuine artist's dilemma, which is precisely where Joyce is at in Ulysses. In the piece, my wandering fictional character reads a poster on a street lamp for what I called The Last School, finds the place and sits down in an auditorium with only one other young man. The lights dim, and a wizened old man steps onto a stage crammed with books and scientific apparatus and all manner of artwork. After admitting that the turnout of 2 was better than he expected, the man says, "Let's get going here, for time is of the essence." He then explains, "The last school begins this very instant, and how long it will take is entirely up to you. Courses, you are free to devise your own, using whatever materials and syllabuses you deem appropriate. There are no classrooms, this hall has only been rented for the day, and no teachers. And of course it goes without saying that there will be no one to grade anything you do, no graduation, and no diploma. Do you have any questions?" And the other guy asks, "Then how do we know when and if we've passed?" And the old man answers, "You will simply know." And that's it. Ponder that little scenario for a moment. Take it in. Because that's where Stephen Dedalus/James Joyce is at in episode 1 of Ulysses. For him, Mulligan and Haynes have taken the easy road with well-defined markings and a lifetime of respect and status at the conclusion. For Dedalusday/Joyce, there are no guarantees and no turning back. And let me just say one more thing on the young Joyce's struggles and where he's at, because this is also key to what's really going on in Ulysses. By their early 20s, young men and young women are ready to pair off. Biology is urging them towards the opposite sex. Imagine for a moment Mulligan, Haynes, and Dedalus going to a party with music, drink, and young Irish lassies in attendance. Mulligan gets chatting with a gal, and after a little flirtatious banter, she asks him what he does. He proudly responds that he's a medical student, and she goes, a doctor. Very interesting. Now later, Haynes chats up the same gal, and again after the preliminaries she asks Haynes what he does. He says, English major and soon to be cushy professor. And again she smiles and says, a professor. Very interesting. Now later again Stephen gets a few moments with our fair young lady. But when she asks him what he doesn't really have a coherent answer for her. Just like in the book, everything he says is spot on, only it's couched in a strange, poetic tongue. The upshot is after 3 minutes of Stephen's company, she'll spot either Mulligan or Haynes and excuse herself. And that, folks, is also where the young Stephen Dedalus/James Joyce is at as the book opens. He is on his own last school-type course of study, and he is extremely lonely for male friendship and female company in the process. But I'll tell you something else before we get back to episode 1. A miracle did occur, and the young James Joyce, perhaps not the James Joyce that we meet at the beginning of Ulysses, more likely the one who departs Bloom's garden at the end, did meet a beautiful young Irish lassie named Nora Barnacle, who would consent to share her life with him. And, not insignificantly, the date Nora and the young Joyce first walked out together was June 6, 1904. So, there you have it. Anyway, in Chapter 1, the Stephen Dedalus of a portrait, having gone off to Paris, read widely in the National Library, and wandered the streets half-starved, has returned to his native land and city to be by his dying mother's bedside. Now she's dead, and Mulligan chides our lonely hero for not praying for her soul as a good Catholic would. Stephen, being the deepest of artistic natures, is profoundly spiritual in his own way, only no longer religious in an organized religion sense, and while he can sing to comfort her at the bedside, he cannot kneel and pray. But the real key here is that Stephen is learning that for the would-be artist, like Thomas Wolfe would write a few decades later, you can't go home again. The friends of a few short years ago are no longer his friends and no longer his companions. He is alone and cannot go backwards, but must forge ahead, wherever that may take him. Mulligan is decent enough at heart, but he's overly mocking, derisive, and undependable. Haynes also is a decent soul, but neither of them can fathom Stephen's true character and struggles. The young men have breakfast. There's much banter, most of it on Mulligan's part, and we're privy to the thoughts of Stephen as he endures it all. After breakfast, they head down to a watering hole for a swim. Stephen, fearing yet to participate in life, avoids the water, and Haynes and he fall into conversation. Now, folks, lots goes on both in Stephen's thoughts and out. Joyce's text is saturated with meaning, but always try to pay very close attention to the things the young Stephen/Joyce says, because he is never frivolous, and everything he says has deep meaning. I especially like when he comments to Haynes that he is the servant of 2 masters, an Englishman, meaning King Edward, and an Italian, meaning Pope Pius. And then he observes, with a profound significance, that there's a third who wants him for odd jobs. For me, that little line, seemingly tossed off in gloomy jest, is at the heart of Ulysses, folks. A third there is who wants him for odd jobs. Anyway, there's a little more banter. Mulligan's brother is off somewhere with friends, and someone is keen on a sweet young thing of a photo girl. And it turns out, the book being as tightly woven as it is, that the sweet young thing in question is none other than the 15-year-old Millicent Bloom, Leopold and Molly's budding daughter. And that's pretty much it. There's a little more crass juvenile banter about the opposite sex. Stephen gives the key to their tower away, determined not to sleep there again. A rendezvous time at a pub around noon is fixed upon, and the episode ends with Stephen walking off. Okay, you're in luck here. Chapter 2 is the shortest one in the book at only 12 pages, and is relatively easygoing after we leave the classroom anyways. Whenever I read this episode and ponder the boys in class and the headmaster, Mr. Deasy, I am reminded of the words tacked to a bulletin board in the days leading up to my dropping out of school for the last time. They said that school was nothing more than an indoctrination process, and that the teachers had little or nothing to teach us because they were simply the best examples of the indoctrination. So, whereas in Chapter 1 we met 3 young men nearing the completion of their studies, 2 for sure at any rate, here in Episode 2 we meet a group of boys early on in their education, and Stephen is tutoring them. The problem is he doesn't believe in what he's doing, filling their minds up with facts and dates that have no relevance to who or what they might become later in life. Besides, he's too deeply involved in his own stuff, pondering over the nature of history and why we still read all these dead folk who are long gone but not forgotten thanks to the written word. The class clambers outside to play hockey, and a boy is left behind to do work on his mathematics. Stephen sees himself in the boy, frail and uncomprehending, and mulls over a mother's love that cares and nurtures for such vulnerable striplings. If nothing else, that is something that's real, he thinks, of course having recently lost his own mother. From the classroom, Stephen moves on to Mr. Deasy's study to be paid for the work he's done. There he's at odds with the adult world of money, duty and responsibility, nationality and religion. Mr. Deasy delivers a few platitudes, but he does sagely remark that Stephen wasn't born to be a teacher, to which our hero replies, a learner rather. Remember my little last school scenario here. 2 other sayings of his seemingly tossed off are of utmost importance to the understanding of what is really going on in the book. The first is, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken, because that is precisely what Stephen Dedalus is in the process of doing in Ulysses. And the second he utters in response to Deasy, proclaiming history to be a movement towards the goal of the manifestation of God. Hearing a shout from the playing field outside, Stephen retorts, that is God. Meaning for him, though he has difficulty putting it into words, God is all life, and that life is no longer to be found in churches or books, but out in the streets. Anyway, Stephen is paid, maybe for the last time. There's a little more about a piece of writing Deasy wants Stephen to place in a newspaper, more platitudes on God and religion, and we get our first glimpse of a recurring theme in Ulysses and life in general in early 20th century Europe, not to mention today, namely the idea of a Catholic or Christian in-group versus a non-believing out-group, or, in this case, anti-Semitism. The chapter ends with Mr. Deasy, that pillar of intellectual and moral authority, walking off, the sun playing on his shoulders like dancing coins. Alright, we've seen our young hero at home amongst his so-called peers and out in the world of conventional education and learning, but here, in episode 3, along the beach at Sandymount Strand is where he really is, puzzling over what might be termed the ultimate mystery. It's not really an easy chapter, but don't worry if you don't get all the references. This is the young James Joyce, 10 years before beginning the writing of Ulysses. He's puzzling over who he is and what is life, signature of all things, he thinks. He is there to read and decipher. Everything he has experienced, everything he has read, and he has read more and deeper than most people, is swirling through his imagination. He contemplates visiting his aunt and uncles, pictures them and his acerbic father's derisive comments. In fact, all of his upbringing, his flight to the continent and encounters in Paris, the letter bidding him come home, his mother's dying. What is life and what is death, he asks, our own and others? What is the key to all? The word that all men come to know. Motherhood, womanhood, and love, what are they, and what else is there now that his mother is gone? He scribbles word images on scraps of paper and ponders, as all artists must, who will read these words of his? And, of course, he is lonely too, and yearns for a love that is not the love of his dead mother. And that's pretty much it for episode 3. What is the key to life? However, one last thing before I leave off this puzzling, riddling episode 3, the young Stephen Dedalus / James Joyce, and part 1 of Ulysses. Let me read a passage to you. We're in Stephen's head here. It goes, after he woke me up last night, same dream, or was it? Wait, open hallway, street of harlots, remember, Harun al-Rashid, I am almosting it. That man led me, spoke. I was not afraid. The melon he had, he held against my face, smiled. Cream fruit smell. That was the rule. Said, in, come. Red carpet spread. You will see who. In the passage, Stephen is recalling a dream from the night before of a dark man, possibly Middle Eastern, in a street of harlots. There's a melon and cream fruit smell, and he is not afraid. Why is this significant? Because later, at the end of episode 9, on the steps of the National Library, a man will pass, and the image is very fitting, between he and his old friend Buck Mulligan. And again, Stephen will recall his dream, the street of harlots and the cream fruit melon held to his face. And that man on the library steps, fittingly passing between Stephen and Buck Mulligan, is none other than Leopold Bloom. Anyway, that's it for part 1 of Ulysses. Thanks for watching the Oomfellows Cafe, and see you next time when we continue the synopsis with part 2 of James Joyce's Ulysses, which will be our introduction to Leopold and Marion Bloom at home. Thanks for watching again. Bye for now, and we'll see you next time.